Every day, hundreds of thousands of babies are born in this world. As this happens, the population of the world continues to grow rapidly. Our current population is fast approaching to approximately 7 billion. This growth greatly affects the natural resources in our ecosystems, causing mass exploitation which can lead to scarcity sometime in the future. If the worst case scenario happens, this scarcity can lead to a dramatic decrease of survival rate to us. Most studies suggest that sustainability is the key to maintain our resources. But the question is, how? How will we be able to sustain life in spite of scarcity? Is it time to be alarmed for mankind's survival as the population continues to increase? These are the questions that we are going to answer herein. Population growth, resource use, and sustainability. Sustainability, a concept that every ecologist and environmentalist suggest in order to maintain balance in our ecosystem. But what exactly is this so-called sustainability? Let's find out with the help of this clip.
Sustainability means that things can keep going, can sustain themselves, can continue into the future and go on forever. From a human perspective, sustainability for our planet means that it can continue to do what it was designed to do: provide fresh air, clean water, produce food, and allow us all to have a high quality of life forever. Unsustainability means that it cannot, and that is where we are now. 20 years ago, scientists in Sweden developed a definition for sustainability with 4 basic principles. These can be seen as the care instructions for our planet. If we follow them, it is good for our planet. And because we're part of the system that is our planet, it's good for us too. The care instructions are as follows: reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and heavy metals, reduce our dependence on synthetic chemicals that persist in nature, reduce our destruction of nature, ensure we are not stopping people globally from meeting their needs. Demand for the Earth's services, clean air, water, food, increases as the population increases and living standards rise, but the Earth's ability to provide these services is declining because of the way we're living. In our search for prosperity, growth and success, we are destroying the system that we as humans are completely dependent upon: nature. We humans have become a threat to our own way of life. The Earth is a system and everything is connected: society, environment and economy. To live sustainably, we need to follow the 4 care instructions and apply them to everything we do at home and at work. If we can follow these care instructions, we can work together to be sustainable. We will all have a better quality of life. We'll waste less, we'll pollute less, and we'll create more things we value in society, while improving our planet's chances of providing us with the very things we need to survive.
So in short, sustainability is a concept which can be learned from natural ecosystems. Interesting. This means that the agriculture, the forestry, and the fisheries are greatly involved in sustainability. Agriculture is one of the major providers of food to us. There are various agricultural practices done. Some people do Sweden agriculture, or the cut and burn method, in which trees are first cut down and burned in order to clear land for planting. This type of agricultural practice is usually done in the tropics. Industrialized agriculture, on the other hand, utilizes machine and fossil fuels instead of the energy supplied by humans and draft animals in traditional agriculture. This is commonly practiced in the temperate region. Sustainable agriculture. The ideal agriculture method to practice. This is characterized by various soil conservation methods, reduced use of pesticides, alternative sources of soil nutrients, and water conservation and protection. Let's learn more about this method in the succeeding clip.
In this video series, you will learn about conservation agriculture cropping system alternatives. These principles include minimum soil disturbance, preservation of residues that provide permanent soil cover, diverse crop rotations, use of cover crops, integrated pest management, reliance on precision, highly effective irrigation, and controlled or limited mechanical traffic over agricultural soils. Conservation agriculture aims to achieve profitable and sustainable agricultural systems and improve the livelihoods of farmers while conserving natural resources.
I'm Fritz Durst, and we are in a local area here called Hungry Hollow, which is 40 miles northwest of Sacramento, and I'm a fifth-generation farmer here. My transition into no-till and conservation farming started back when I was in my late teens. The ag depression hit in the late 80s, and some used no-till equipment came up at a reasonable price. I leased my own land and I dedicated it to my process.
My name's Garth Williams. We are in the middle of a dryland barley field in northern Yolo County. For me, it was being I started off farming from scratch. We didn't have the disc or any of the other equipment your conventional farmer had. As we started buying equipment, we just bought no-till equipment, which included drill and a sprayer for the most part. So no-till just made sense.
Well, no-till is exactly how it sounds. No-till would be to use as minimum amount of soil disturbance as you can afford. That introduces a whole new way of thinking about how to do agriculture.
I saw a bumper sticker one time that said, "Stop treating your soil like dirt." And that's kind of been my mantra now is I look and what does my soil need, and that's what we try to do.
While Durst and Williams are employing a no-till conservation tillage system, other farmers are using minimum tillage as a conservation tillage method.
Minimum tillage comes underneath the umbrella of conservation tillage. Just less tillage, less expense, and trying to adopt strategies that still give us the same yields.
Over time, though, as people have gotten used to that, they're seeing soil quality improvements. They're seeing actual forage quality improvements, which translates to long-term better soil health, long-term better herd health in the case of the dairies. So not only is there an immediate cost reduction and profit improvement, but there's long-term quality building factors.
With conservation agricultural systems, we're integrating both soil management and water management practices. One of the things that we're finding is that by preserving residues on the surface, we're actually decreasing the amount of evaporation substantially during the season, thereby increasing our water use efficiencies.
You increase that biological diversity, you increase the size of the biology in the system, and that biology then embodies those nutrients and keeps them within a living pool and doesn't allow them to escape as easily as it would in a sort of more disturbance-based system that revolved around tillage.
This crop we're standing in right here are garbanzo beans or chickpeas. I'm trying to grow my own nitrogen now. What we have right here are the rhizobacteria that produce nitrogen. And these nodules harvest nitrogen out of the air, provide it to the roots of the plant. The plants are then nitrogen rich, don't need to be fertilized. And after the crop matures and dies out, there's residual nitrogen in the soil. So these are what I'm shooting for.
Well, I think it all starts with looking at conservation tillage as objectively as possible. If a farmer is interested in conservation tillage, they really need to research it. But the other part of it is to go around and find those farmers who are successful in applying conservation tillage practices.
You have to have the innovative growers out there. You have to have those growers that are willing to stick their neck out and make it work. A lot of people think that the systems are going to work the very first year. It takes several years to get a conservation tillage system really working for you.
In agriculture right now, 80% of our inputs are fossil fuel or energy related. In 150 years, we won't have fossil fuels. So how are we going to make that transition? And you start looking at the California system where it's just huge inputs of water. Are you going to be able to access that much water 150 years or 50 years or 20 years from now? It becomes a real issue.
I think the biggest limitation that we have is that distance between our ears and being open to change, open to ideas, and experiment and find out what works out on your farm, because that's what makes the difference, is what applies to your situation. Test and try, continually test and try.
It would have been easy to give up, move on, do something different, go back to the way I was farming. But if I stopped and looked at the way I was farming, I had lots of failures there with the way I was farming. And I had fewer failures with my no-till. And so people say, well, what do you mean by failures, Fritz? Well, failures in the sense that all my soil was washing off my land. Failure in the sense that I couldn't capture all that rainfall that fell. God would give me 22 inches of rain and 6 inches of that rain ran off. So I didn't realize it, but I was living in a world of failure. And I've now realized it could be a lot better. And I challenge other farmers to start to think outside of the box, to think the same way. How can we make that system better?
The world's population keeps growing. By 2050, we'll have to double our food production. For that, we'll need genetic engineering, advanced pesticides, and fertilizer. Lots of fertilizer. That's why at Agricon, we're working every day, hand in hand with farmers and their families. And don't
Many economists say that in order to maintain sustainability of the agricultural sector, it must increase productivity, and in order to do this more efficiently, they will need to utilize industrial agriculture. But is it so? The following video will tell us the truth behind industrial agriculture.
The world's population keeps growing. By 2050, we'll have to double our food production. For that, we'll need genetic engineering, advanced pesticides, and fertilizer. Lots of fertilizer. That's why at Agricon, we're working every day, hand in hand with farmers and their families. And don't you want to feed the world?
Messages like this one seem to be popping up everywhere, but who's really behind them? Turns out it's the corporations profiting from this way of farming, like those selling the pesticides, fertilizers, and chemicals. They're spending billions to warn us that their way is the only way, with industry groups like the Alliance to Feed the Future, whose members include the Association for Dressings and Sauces and the National Frozen Pizza Institute. But ask farmers who really know how to feed us, and you'll get a very different story. A heartbreaking and hopeful story that I've heard talking to hundreds of families like this one. 50 years of this myth and the lobbying dollars to support it have tilted the playing field to favor corporate-controlled chemical agriculture, giving farmers little or no support for any other path. So it's easy to understand a lot of farmers feel it's either get on board or get out. Getting on board means farmers stop practices that keep soil healthy and go for single crops, Livestock that used to be raised on the farm get crammed into polluting factories. To keep this unnatural system going, these farmers now buy expensive inputs, all from ever fewer corporations demanding ever-rising prices. It's a quick addiction. Pests become resistant, so you've got to use more chemicals. Livestock becomes sicker, so you've got to use more drugs. Soil loses its natural fertility, so you've got to use more chemical fertilizer. Then on the other side, when farmers try to sell their crops, they face only a few big buyers offering unpredictable prices. The economics don't work for long. Over the last 50 years, millions of desperate farmers have had to sign contracts with corporations that dictate their every move, or have lost their farms altogether. More and more farm income is concentrating at the top, so now only 1 in 10 U.S. farms can support a family. In many other countries, a similar thing is happening. Small farmers who buy into the promise that corporate agriculture is the solution often get trapped by debt and dependency. So yes, corporate agriculture is good for some folks, including some of the largest growers, but not the typical farm family. And that's strike one for this myth. But we have to feed the world, right? And if not this way, what choice do we have? A great one. We just don't see ads for it, and it certainly isn't getting the subsidies going to corporate ags. State-of-the-art sustainable farming ends this unnatural chemical addiction. It uses better practices, not ever more expensive purchases. Sustainable farmers build healthy soil by planting a variety of crops and rotating them. They raise their animals on the farm, not in cramped factories. They fertilize using compost and livestock or planting soil-nourishing crops. Healthier plants with good crop rotation also help keep pests in check without hurting the bugs we need, like those all-important pollinators. How does this choice impact everyone else? Massively. Industrial farms degrade and erode precious topsoil. 64 tons per acre are being lost every year in some spots in our heartland. They suck up huge amounts of water, a lot of it from deep underground, essentially irreplaceable. And they use millions of pounds of antibiotics, a practice that leads to dangerous new bacteria. They also produce toxic runoff that pollutes our rivers, our oceans, and us. The average American already has at least 13 pesticides in our bodies. And thanks to chemicals in the field, farmers and farm workers have higher rates of many cancers. So the sustainable farm is better for farmers and the environment. But can it really feed the world? Study after study is saying yes. Sustainable farms produce as well, and in drought years, even better. This is important news for small farmers who already grow 70% of the world's food. To increase production, they don't have to follow the chemical path. And the future we're all talking about feeding? The industrial farm requires more fossil fuels, water, and mined minerals, all stuff that will only get more expensive as it runs out. So down the line, the chemical path not only can't work for farmers, it won't be a choice at all. Corporate agriculture doesn't reliably grow more food in the future or even today. And that's strike two for this myth. But we still haven't looked at the biggest hole of all. They say we need to double food production or we'll go hungry. Really? We already have almost 3,000 calories a day available for every human being on Earth. More than enough. And that's after wasting a third of all food grown. And a lot of what is grown isn't food we eat directly. A third of the world's grain is going to livestock. In the U.S., our biggest crop is corn, but less than 1% of all corn planted is what we eat. Most goes to fuel or feed. So staying on this track, we could increase production and still have more hunger. To end it, everybody has to have the power to buy or grow the food they need. And that's what sustainable farming is all about. Strike three for this dangerous myth. So the next time someone who makes frozen pizza or toxic pesticides tells you there's only one way to feed the future, tell them their story is full of holes. The evidence is clear. Sustainable farmers prove we all can enjoy healthy food, and we each have power to make this happen. We can redirect our own food dollars and the billions in public money now going into the pockets of big ag. We can stand up and speak out for sustainable farmers here and around the world.
The logging industry appears to have developed for the past decades. Trees from the forest provide us shelter, paper, and most of our home furniture. But as logging continues, The problem of deforestation continues to increase gradually also. Such problem is not exclusive to the wildlife. Us people are also gravely affected by deforestation. Due to this dilemma, Mother Nature is also letting us taste our own medicine. In the present time, many lives perish every year due to the great floods and devastating typhoons. The solution to this problem? Sustainable forestry. Let's take an example of this type of forestry from the Swedes.
Boreal forests are spreading out across the northern hemisphere like a green belt. Here lies the Kingdom of Sweden, whose forests constitute less than 1% of the world's forest acreage, but which yield 5% of all forestry products used in the world, and a whole 10% of the turnover of the global export market. How can that be possible? The answer lies in a unique method of sustainable forestry called the Swedish model. But it's been a long haul to get where we are today. 100 years ago, large areas of the Swedish forests were heavily exploited with little replenishment.
Back then, the forests were very different from today. They were decimated by felling, they were sparse and often influenced by forest grazing, while at the same time the conservation value of the forest was high, mainly because we had a lot of old timber still standing. But in the 1800s, logging had increased significantly and the regrowth was very low.
Things got so bad that during the late 1800s, the Swedish state realized that something had to be done. The forests had to remain an important source of raw materials for the future, which resulted in the world's first legislation on forest management in 1903.
Yes, it meant that they attempted to secure a long-term supply of forestry-associated products in Sweden. Put simply, sustainability meant that whoever removed forest had the responsibility of replenishing it.
The law stipulated the type of forest to be felled, as well as the fraction of forest which could be cut in any given area. A government agency was formed to ensure that these regulations were adhered to, a ministry which today is known as the Swedish Forest Agency.
The Forest Agency's mission is to see to it that the country's forests are managed in such a way that the government and parliament have defined, which means working to achieve managed sustainability. Of course, we have a responsibility to ensure that the regulations are adhered to according to the Act of Parliament. We also have an advisory role to play towards landowners' operations. Thirdly, we have the vitally important task of following up the forest progress throughout the country.
Slowly, the Swedish forest landscape began changing shape. Sparse forests with low growth rates were felled and new forest land was laid out. Gradually, the forest landscape became a patchwork of timber stands of different ages. The goal was to achieve a situation where there were ample forests with timber of all age groups. What was needed was a very long-term plan. A tree that was a sapling in the early 1900s was ready for harvesting 100 years later. The overall purpose of the transformation was to create conditions for a secure and sustainable supply of timber needs to cover Sweden's upcoming requirements. To enable long-term sustainable forestry, all forest land was inventoried. The National Forest Inventory was launched already in 1923 and has given Sweden unique knowledge. This knowledge is being used today to decide upon how to utilize Sweden's forests. It was during the 70s that the environmental movement was gaining influence. The Forestry Act came to be a target of criticism and debate, particularly as the clear-cutting method was very intense. Many argued that the law was too narrowly directed towards production and economics. It did not take sufficiently into account the natural values and biodiversity of the forests. The debate led to a new forest policy and a new legislation.
The big change was that both the environment and forest production became equal goals in forestry policy. It also meant that the general public clearly defined how they wanted the forests to develop. One wanted more alternative logging methods instead of clear-cutting. Also more leaf-bearing or deciduous trees. What it also meant was that you removed a lot of detailed requirements within the legislation itself. Disclosure was no longer mandatory. Badly growing forests were no longer required to be compulsorily felled. As the collective claims against the forest increased, there was a need for trade-offs. Maximising production as well as the environmental collateral isn't easy in the same stretch of forest. Forest managers face the challenge of balancing production against the environmental goals.
Carina Nygren Svensson is one of over 300,000 private individuals who own woodland in Sweden. She has been living off of agriculture and her forests, which have been handed down for 6 generations.
We are farmers and foresters, so the forest economy is important. Some members of our family are interested in fishing and hunting, so the forest is ideal because it's full of deer, moose, beavers and bears. In the late summer and autumn, we're often in the forest to pick berries and to see what work needs to be done. For example, whether we should thin the stands, or maybe even do some logging.
In Sweden, half of all forest lands are owned by private individuals. Another quarter is owned by private companies, and the rest is owned by the state and the church. The same forestry laws apply to all categories of interested parties. To be able to comply with the law requires knowledge and commitment from managers. He or she must possess a certain amount of knowledge about forestry management, economics and ecology.
Our forest is certified and we manage it according to a forestry plan, so that our activities are sustainable and that the forest retains its value in the long term for our children and grandchildren.
Forest landowners in Sweden have considerable freedom to manage their forests in any way they wish, though it does bring with it many obligations. This policy is summarized usually as freedom with responsibility.
This policy places great demands upon the forest managers and landowners. You have to have devised some kind of mission statement for owning the land and your forestry operations, which also places considerable burden upon your knowledge of how different production methods affects the forest itself.
In addition to the obligation of replacing harvested timber with new forest, the law requires that consideration be shown to other aspects of the forest, such as recreation, tourism, cultural relics, and of course the nature itself. Today, the balance between the environment and production is once again a topical subject. Sharp criticisms have been directed at the Swedish Forest Agency by environmental organizations.
There are several areas where the views of the interested parties tend to differ. One important area is the proportion of protected forests. That is to say, the area of set-aside forest needed to succeed in preserving biodiversity. But then on the other hand, there is also a conflict about what one may do in the managed part of the landscape. There are differing opinions about the logging methods employed, such as clear-cutting. There is also a lot of discussion about how much nature consideration should be taken during harvesting.
The Association for the Protection of Forests is one of a number of Swedish environmental organizations that are critical of modern forestry.
Swedish forestry, as it stands today, is the single greatest threat to biodiversity in Sweden. I base this upon 2 criteria. Firstly, most of the endangered red-listed species live in the forest, and secondly, forestry affects more than half of the Swedish land acreage. The most important thing is to prevent the conversion of natural forest to monocultural plantations with single tree species, but instead, after felling, sow seed trees so that you get a natural regeneration of different kinds of trees. Don't just plant one kind of tree, but bring some mixed seedlings with you so that in the future you will have mixed forests. Naturally, this will increase the biodiversity greatly, compared to monocultures.
The discussions about the balance between forestry and nature conservation are topical once more, while the effects of the 90s forestry policy are becoming noticeable. Approximately 1% of the Swedish forests are harvested each year. This means that the increased environmental concerns are reflected by about 20% of forest land. That is to say, the proportion of forest land harvested since the middle of the 90s.
A lot has happened in the forest during the last 20 years. Within forestry, new approaches have been developed, such as ecological landscape planning or the creation and retention of important structures for forest species, for example deadwood. There are certain indications that these measures have had positive effects. But in reality, 20 years is too short a time to draw many conclusions. It is mainly due to the fact that the rotation periods are so long in the boreal forests. And this is also true for many other ecological processes, which also require a lot of time.
In Sweden, society's needs for timber is increasing. For example, forests have become one of the main sources of energy, while the rest of the world increases its needs for renewable energy significantly.
Proportionately, the European Union has set extremely high targets for the supply of energy from renewable sources. This means that demand for forestry products will increase in the near future, as demand will exceed supply.
Forests can play a crucial role in supplying the world with raw materials. Forest products can be used for everything from building and heating homes, developing medicines, clothes and chemicals.
Wood will be used for an incredible number of things in the future. You just have to look at what things were like 20 years ago compared to how they are today. Previously, we could really only extract pulp and warmth from our facilities. Now we have composite materials, textile pulp, even pine tree diesel. Then looking ahead, we will be able to win organic polymers like lignin and hemicellulose, a black viscous byproduct from the mill's operations. A great potential for the future.
The challenge to researchers is to find ways to adapt the woodlands to all requirements: recreation, hunting and fishing, adventure, biodiversity, pure water, renewable energy and raw materials. The demands upon the forests are ever growing.
Yes. Some of the major challenges that face us is balancing and prioritizing two different conflicting interests. The ambition is to meet all the claims upon the forests, but the challenge is to find that sensible balance of how to use the landscape as a whole. The reason is that all interests cannot be accommodated on every stretch of woodland.
With a forest industry based upon sound scientific principles and a forestry policy under constant development, Sweden has gone from being a country under deforestation to be the most densely forested country within the European Union. Now we are all facing the big challenge. How do we use the world's forests in a future that has to rely upon renewable resources? Is the Swedish model part of that solution?
Fishes and sea creatures are also major sources of food. Due to this fact, massive fishing and fish kills deteriorate the oceanic biodiversity. As this phenomenon happens, scarcity envelops the aquatic lives. Thus, many fishermen nowadays are starting to consider sustainable fishing in order to retain the diversity of the underwater world.
With more than 200 million people reliant on the world's oceans for their livelihood, creation of a sustainable global fisheries industry is a critical issue at the upcoming Rio+20 UN Conference on Sustainable Development.
I think the biggest threats to fisheries resources in the ocean, number one is overfishing. We're probably basically there are too many boats chasing too few fish.
UNDP partnered with the local government in South India to help fishermen continue to earn a living while at the same time protecting their fragile environment. More than 2.5 billion people depend on the ocean's fish as their #1 source of protein.
We've seen in some cases when a fishery is really pushed over the limit, not only does it collapse, but if it gets too far, it doesn't recover at all. New species will come in to take over that vacuum that's created by the species that's been overfished. And even when the fishing pressure on the original target species is reduced, in some cases you won't see recovery. So it's very important to get it right at the beginning, or you could actually start to see a global deficit in fisheries. Roughly half the world's fish stocks are considered fully exploited. We can't exploit any more without them, facing collapse. A quarter are depleted or overexploited or even collapsed, and maybe only one remaining quarter is considered fish sustainable.
Since the implementation of this partnership, coral reef has recovered to nearly 50%. An annual 2.5-month ban on fishing ensures fish stocks will regenerate year after year, and the local communities are empowered to sustainably manage the ecosystem vital to their economy.
We know the suite of issues. We know the main sort of root causes of these issues. So it isn't necessarily about throwing large sums of money at these problems. I mean, you need money, but it's about getting the right political will to make the necessary policy and other decisions that can then let the market do its wonders if the right signals are sent through policy.
Population growth is inevitable. It cannot be stopped. So in order to continue the sustainability of our motherland, we must continue to do something in order to conserve our resources. It is great to know that many sectors of the society promote the incorporation of sustainability in different activities regarding with the usage of our resources. Therefore, we need not to be alarmed while the population continues to grow if we practice sustainable development. Let us increase the awareness and utilization of sustainable activities for the welfare and survival of the future generations. Let us continue to intensify our wisdom towards the right usage and conservation of our remaining natural resources. Let us teach the future generations in economizing our resources properly. Let us act now.